What's up guys, Justin here with TheSketchUpEssentials.com. So in this video, we're going to continue our series on bringing our model into Unreal Engine by talking about how we can edit and customize materials inside of the engine. Let's go ahead and just jump into it. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to go over before we start talking about materials in general is why we're not seeing the materials that came over from the SketchUp model that look like this. So if we jump over into Unreal Engine, right, and we take a look at this, notice how this face isn't showing up. And there's a reason for that. The reason is because those faces aren't oriented properly. And so it's just not showing up in the model at all. So one of the things that you need to do is you need to, inside of your SketchUp model, and ideally this is a check that you perform before you export this model over to Unreal Engine, is you want to make sure that you've gone through and made sure that your materials are applied to the proper faces. And notice how if I jump into the shaded mode or the monochrome mode, you can see that these faces right here are that gray color, meaning they're oriented the wrong way. And so if I was to click into this real quick, right, if I was to double click until I got to this raw face, notice how this does have that material applied to it. And you can see it by jumping back into shaded with textures, and it's showing it in SketchUp, but because the wrong side of the face is showing up, that doesn't actually get shown in Unreal Engine. So to fix that, what you can do is you can click in here, right? So double click until you get to this raw face, and then you just want to right click and you want to reverse the faces. And so you may need to do that with your window in here as well, just because these faces are not oriented properly. Otherwise, they're not going to show up properly in Unreal Engine because your face orientation is important. So I'm going to go ahead and right click and I'm going to reverse these faces. Then I'm also going to go over here and do the same thing. Now, one thing to note about that though is if I jump back into my material mode right here, notice how my materials are no longer showing up on those faces. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to make sure that I've applied that proper material to this face. So notice how it's on the back side and we want it to be on the front side. And that same material is actually applied over on this face right here. So you can just use the material sampler and then apply that to these surfaces like this. Okay, so once I'm done with that, I want to do a file save. I want to click on the button for synchronize with direct link. And notice what that does is that's going to re-import this surface right here. Well, now those materials are actually showing up inside of Unreal Engine. Okay, so now we've got our object here in Unreal Engine. Let's say that we wanted to replace some materials, or we wanted to add some PBR maps or something like that. So the easiest way to replace materials inside of Unreal Engine is to use stuff that's already set up to work with the engine, right? So what we're going to be talking about in a minute is we're going to be talking about bringing in our custom textures and applying them to a surface by creating a material. But the fastest way to do that is actually to use the Quixel library. So if I click in here, right, if I click the drop down and I go into get content Quixel bridge, what that's going to do is that's going to open up this page right here directly inside of Unreal Engine where I can actually go into the surfaces. I can actually download materials that are built into the Quixel library. There's a number of different materials in here. So this is going to be the fastest way to do this, because what you can do is you can click into like your wood veneer, for example, and let's say that I wanted to add a wall panel like this one to the underside of that surface. So what you can do is you can click on it, and then over here on the right hand side of the page there's an option in here for a quality level. And generally speaking, unless I'm doing like really high resolution like close-up stuff, I try to keep these a little bit smaller just to keep my file size smaller. But you can just click on the button right here to add. And so when you click on add, what that's going to do is that's going to add this into your library. Now let's jump back into Unreal Engine really quick. And notice what that did is that created a folder, which is the Megascans folder, and it gives me basically this wood veneer material. And so notice what that did is that brought in a material that I could then drag in here. And let's say, for example, that I wanted to put this on the interior right here. I can drag it onto this surface. Now, one of the things you might note about this is sometimes you have some issues in here with the size of materials and the way that they get mapped on this surface. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. We can go ahead and talk about that right now. So sometimes you get some weird UV mapping issues that happen when you bring things in from SketchUp and the sizes aren't correct. Well, notice how what this created here is a material instance. And so what I want to do is I want to double click on this material instance, and you can also find it by clicking on this object right here that we've applied this to, right? So if I click on this object and then go over and look at the information about it in the details pane over here, notice how there's a material in here that I can double click on to adjust. So you can kind of adjust that in either place. But notice how there's a ton of different options in here for things that you can do, right? So you can toggle on different maps in here, or you can toggle on parameters about this map where you can actually adjust it and change it. But there's also an option at the very top where you can adjust the tiling and offset. And so if I check this box right here, notice how this material has the option to adjust the X and Y tiling. And so what that's going to do, and you can kind of see it in the preview pane right here, what that's going to do is that's going to allow you to make that material bigger or smaller. So when you do that, right, notice how I can adjust this using the tiling settings right here. And what I want to do is I want to adjust this, there we go, where that material looks okay on this surface right here. So notice how that is kind of making the tiling on this preview pane look kind of big. That's okay, because we're really worried about how that wood material is going to look inside of Unreal Engine like this. So once we're done with that, what we can do is we can save this. And so when we save it, what that's going to do is that's going to finalize the changes to that material right here. And now notice how it's a lot bigger and it fits on these surfaces properly. So if I drag that in here like this, notice how it's going to do the same thing, right? So I can use that in order to quickly use those Quixel materials on these surfaces right here. But now let's talk a little bit about what if we wanted to bring in our own material and set it up. And so this is a little bit complicated when you first look at it, but it's not really ultra complicated once you understand the way that it works. So first thing we want to do is we want to download a material from somewhere. So let's say, for example, that I wanted this to have more of like a corrugated metal on this surface, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to go find a corrugated metal material. And if you're looking for some websites where you can download textures for your SketchUp models, you can check out TheSketchUpEssentials.com/materials, where you can download a list of websites where you can download materials that are going to work for this. However, in this case, we're just going to use the website 3dassets.one, and I'm just going to look for metal panel. So if I search for metal panel, I'm looking for something that might be a little bit corrugated. This one might look okay, but I think I'm going to go with this corrugated metal panel right here from CG Bookcase. And so we want to make sure that we've selected the metalness, roughness, workflow. And you can select, I'm going to go with the 2K right here, and I'm just going to download this material. And so what that's going to do is that's going to download this zipped file, which you can unzip, which is going to contain the different maps that we want for our model. And these maps are important because they do things like changing the way that these materials look and interact with light. And I will actually link to a guide on how to use PBR materials at TheSketchUpEssentials.com/PBR materials, so that you can actually see some information about the way that this works. But now what we want to do is we want to jump back into Unreal Engine, and we want to add these texture files to our one of our folders. So in this case, for example, I'm going to create a folder for my own materials. So I'm just going to right click in my content folder. I'm going to click on new folder, and I'm going to create a folder called materials. And so what I want to do, and you can do this a couple different ways, it's all about how you want to stay organized, but I'm going to right click in here again, and I'm going to create a textures folder. I'm going to drag those materials that I just downloaded into the textures folder right here. Now remember, this is where it's important to understand the difference between texture files, which are basically flat image files, right? If I double click on this, you can see this right here. But these are image files, and we need to create a material that actually incorporates them into the way that it looks, so that it has all of these in here and it has all of the aspects that we want for a realistic material. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to go back into this materials folder, and I want to right click and I want to create a new material. So if I right click in here, notice how there's options for a bunch of different things. I want to select the option for material right here. And so when I do that, what I can do is I can just type in corrugated metal panel, or whatever you want to call that, right? And so what that does is that creates a blank material. Now we need to set up this material so that it references those different maps. And so if I double click on this, okay, and so what this is going to do is this is going to bring up the Unreal Engine Material Editor. And the Unreal Engine Material Editor is the place where you can go in order to actually set up these materials. And so it's based on using nodes for your setup. So a lot of you might be more familiar with using like different slots or things like that. It's not that different once you get an idea of the way everything works. But what we need to do is, you see all of these different maps in here. We need to plug in our maps to these maps right here so that this material actually looks the way that it's supposed to. So the easiest way to do this is you can just click on your content drawer right here, and you can go find those textures that you just brought in, right? So there's a textures folder right here. And for example, we want this map right here, which is the base color. It's the image that makes up the base material. And we want to drag this into this editor. And so when we do that, notice what it does is it creates this texture sample node. We can take this texture sample node, we can drag the RGB value, which is basically the image, into our base color right here. And so notice how when we do that, this is going to show us a preview of what this material is going to look like. One of the things that I find helpful is you can either set this to like a plane or a cube primitive like this, so we can get kind of a preview of what this material is going to look like. So we've got our corrugated metal panel in here. We also want to drag the other maps in. So I'm going to drag the ambient occlusion in, and I'm going to plug this into the ambient occlusion slot. We'll bring in our height map. We'll plug it into, I believe this one is the world position offset. Okay, we'll go ahead and we'll drag this normal map in here, and we're just going to plug the RGB of the normal map into the normal, and then we want to drag our last map in, which is our roughness, which is going to affect the reflections. We're going to drag our roughness into the roughness slot right here. And so if we look at this material, notice how now it's doing a lot more things like reflection in here, right? So the way that the light is reflecting off of this corrugated metal panel is a lot better, right? It's reflecting off of the inside, but then it's also giving us kind of a less reflective look, where this would be steeper in here. So it's just a better material, right? So now what I want to do is I want to click on the option for save. And so we're going to take this material, we're going to save it. And then let's say that we wanted to drag this onto our surface. We can do that just by dragging it on here like this. Okay, so now one of the things that you might notice in here is you might notice that this material is a little bit big, right? We probably don't want our corrugated metal panels to look quite that big. And so what we need to do is we need to add the ability to adjust these inside of Unreal Engine itself. Okay, and so we want to make this adjustable, right? And so the way that we want to do that is UVs are basically the way that a 3D modeling engine knows how to place textures on a surface. Well, in this case, what we want to do is we want to add a specific node, and notice how I can drag off of this, and it's actually going to give me the ability to create a node in here. And I want to look for, I'm going to go a COOR, and we want to look for texture coordinate. So we want to add a texture coordinate node right here, and we want to plug it into the surface. And so when we do that, notice what that's going to do is that's going to give us the ability over here on the left hand side in order to adjust this, right? So if I was to drag this, notice how this material is going to reload in here, and it's going to have a different size associated with it. So it's going to be larger or smaller. And if I was to save that change to this material, notice how it's going to change over here. But what we want to do is we want to make this a little bit easier, right? And so the way that we're going to do that is we're going to use some math in here. And what we're going to do is we're going to make this easily adjustable. So what I want to do is I just want to drag off of here, and I just want to add a multiply node. So we're just going to type in multiply or select multiply, then drag that into our UVs right here. And there's a reason for this, which I'll show you in a second. But we basically want to plug a value in here. And so what this is going to do is this is going to allow us to set a factor and use that factor in order to multiply the X and the Y of our materials. And so what we want to do is we want to add a value in here. And what I can do is I can just hold the S key down and click, and that's going to create a parameter in here, right? And so a parameter is basically going to be a value that we're going to be able to edit off to the right hand side of this. This will get important in a second, but we're just going to click on it. I'm going to hit F2, and I'm going to rename this to texture scale, and I'm going to plug this in like this. So now we've got this texture scale value in here that we can basically adjust by adjusting this value in here like this. And so what we want to do is this is basically something that we're going to be able to edit outside of this material graph. But the first thing I want to do is I want to take the output of this, and I want to make sure that I'm plugging it into all of these different textures, because what it's doing, right, is it's changing the mapping. And so you want to make sure that all of these different texture images have that same UV applied to them, so that when you make this bigger or smaller, it's going to adjust this texture size right here, as well as adjusting all the different maps as well. But then when we're done with this, we want to go ahead and we want to click on the save option right here. Let's jump back over into Unreal Engine for a second. So what I want to do is notice how if I was to double click on this material right here, it's going to pop up this shader editor, right? That's not necessarily what we want, because what we want is we might want different copies of the same material that we can adjust independently. So what I want to do instead is I want to take this material and I want to right click on it and I want to create a material instance. And we can just hit the enter key right here, but notice how this is different than this file right here. So what this is this is a material instance, which is a copy of the material that references this parent file for its base characteristics, but then it has some editable things to it. So if I was to take this metal panel object, right, and drag it on this surface right here, I'm basically replacing the old material with this new one. But if I was to double click on this, notice how this looks different. Right? What it does is it pulls up a window that looks a lot like the window that we had when we worked with the Megascans material. And notice how one of the options that's in here is that option that we set up to adjust our texture scale. Right? So if I edit this, or if I check this box, notice how I have a slider in here, and I can adjust that multiplication factor, which is going to adjust how big or small that material is, like this. And then once we're done, we can just click on the save button, right? So what we've done is we've set up a material that's easily editable and adjustable. And one of the reasons that this is powerful is because if we were to duplicate this, right? So let's say we wanted a different size metal panel over here, what we could do is we could duplicate this instance, right? We could drag that on here and we could edit this material. So I could just go double click on it right here, and I could make this one bigger. Right? So if I drag this slider, which you can't really see, notice how this material is changing independently of this material over here. So you can use this in order to create multiple different sized copies of a material in here. So I'm gonna go ahead and drag that onto the surface. We'll do the same thing over here. So notice how applying these to these surfaces is really easy. Now, one other thing that I want to talk about real quick, because I know materials is like a big topic, right? But let's say that we wanted to adjust how reflective this material is, right? So I'm going to go in and look at this. Notice how we've got light reflecting off of it right here. And I want to adjust how strongly that light reflects across the surface. And so basically what I want to do is I want to add a slider where I can adjust the strength of the roughness of the material, right? And so remember, we don't want to edit these material instances. We want to edit the parent. And so a really easy way to find the parent of this material is to just right click on it down here and click on the option for Find Parent, and that'll highlight that parent. But what I want to do is I want to double click in here, and what we want to do is we want to take our roughness value, right, which is the node that's coming off of this texture right here, and we want to add a multiplication factor, kind of like we did before. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to right click in here and I'm going to look for a multiply in my math, and we'll go ahead and we'll drag this in here, we'll drag this back into our roughness right here, and then we're just going to do the same thing, right? We're going to hold S and click in order to add a parameter, and we're going to call this one roughness strength. We're going to drag that into this option right here. And so notice how when I do that, and you can kind of see this with the way that the light is working in here, if I was to adjust that roughness strength up, notice what happens is this is going to get less shiny, right? If I was to drag it down, it's going to get more shiny. So we could set our default value for this to something like 1. But now, if I click on Save, what that's going to do is that's going to apply that to all of the material instances in our world settings. So notice how this got less shiny, right? But if I was to select this and then double click on this instance, notice how I'm now going to have a slider in here called roughness strength. And so what the roughness strength value is going to do, and I'm going to drag this to the right just so you can see this, is it's going to give me the ability to adjust the roughness of this material. So notice how if I drag that to the left and I make this value smaller, like this material gets more shiny. If I drag it to the right, notice how it gets less shiny in the 3D space. So you can do that for all of those different maps in order to adjust or make them adjustable and make it so that you can adjust the roughness strength, or really the strength of any of these materials inside of Unreal Engine. And when we're done, we're just going to click on Save. We're going to close out of this like this. Okay, and so let's say that we wanted to rotate this material, right? What you can do, so we're going to drag off of here and we're going to add a custom rotator, right? And we're going to pick the one that's under texturing right here. And then I'm going to take this, I'm going to place it in my A value right here. But notice what this is going to do is this is going to give us the ability to add a rotation angle in here. So to do that, I'm just going to hold S and click, and we're just going to call this texture rotation, right? So we've just created one more parameter in here. We're going to drag this into our rotation angle. And so notice how if I was to adjust this, this basically works from 0 to 1, right? So if I was to place my default value at 0.25, what that's going to do is that's going to rotate this basically a quarter of a turn, or 90 degrees. And so what I want to do in this case is I want to set my default value to 0. I want to set my slider maximum to 1, because this is going to show up as a slider inside of my materials, right? But then I'm going to save this right here, and remember, because I'm changing the parent, this is going to get added to all of the instances that reference that. But now if I go back into this material right here, which is this one, and I edit it, I now have the option in here to do a texture rotation. And so in this case, I'm going to type in a value of 0.25. Well, when I do that, what that's going to do is that's going to rotate my material basically 90 degrees. And in this case, for this one, I don't want to do a texture rotation, but I do want to do it over here on this other material instance. You know, it's kind of an accent. So I'm going to take this other instance, I'm going to drag it in here, I'm going to adjust this, and I'm going to set my texture rotation to 0.25. And then I'm going to click on Save. Notice how that only gets applied to this material, or this material over here, not to these material instances. So now if I take a look at this, and maybe I would really want it to be more on this surface right here. So maybe I'll just slide that over here. But notice how I've got the different directions that these materials are facing right here. And I could also, if I wanted to, adjust my texture scale. So say I wanted this one to have a little bit different size, I could kind of adjust it to that value of 2 right there. All right, so that's like a super high level overview of materials in Unreal Engine. You could do full courses just on the material editing in there, but if you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below. In the next video, we'll talk a little bit about lighting and how we can set that up. But as always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this, and I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks, guys.